March 28, 1942, 1:24 in the morning. The Loire estuary is lit by searchlights and streaked with tracer fire. An old American destroyer, stripped down, disguised as a German torpedo boat, and carrying 4.5 tons of high explosive concealed in concrete beneath her bow, is racing toward the most heavily defended port on the French Atlantic coast at 19 knots. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty grips the wheel. The ship shudders with every shell impact. Men are dying on the deck behind him. The forward gun has gone silent. The entire superstructure is perforated with holes. One of the funnels is on fire. He does not slow down. In less than 90 seconds, he will either ram the outer gate of the Normandie Dock or be torn apart by coastal batteries before he gets there. The ship is HMS Campbeltown. She is 23 years old, a relic of the First World War, transferred from the mothballed American fleet in 1940. She was headed for the scrapyard. Now she is headed for history. Behind her, in the black water of the estuary, 16 wooden motor launches are being slaughtered. They carry 265 commandos, men trained to kill, demolish, and disappear. But there is nowhere to disappear. The Germans have turned the river into a shooting gallery. Boats are burning, men are drowning. Fuel tanks are exploding in orange fireballs that reflect off the low clouds. And the Campbeltown keeps going. Because inside her bow, hidden behind steel plating and sealed in concrete so thick that no casual inspection could find it, sits enough Amatol explosive to crack the dock gate like an eggshell. And the fuse is already running. But this is not just a story about one explosion, one ship, or one impossible night. It is about how the British High Command looked at a map, studied the mathematics of naval war, and realized they did not need to sink the most dangerous battleship in Europe. They only needed to destroy the one place on the entire Atlantic coast where she could ever be repaired. That calculation, one rusting destroyer traded for the permanent neutralization of a 42,000-ton monster, would become one of the coldest, most brilliant equations of the Second World War. And the Germans would not understand it until 10 hours after the ship struck the gate. By then, over 100 of their own officers would be standing on the bomb. This is exactly the kind of wartime story that vanishes behind the famous campaigns. A raid so improbable that even the men who planned it called it suicide. So successful that it reshaped German strategy for years, and so costly that entire commando units were wiped out in a single night. The explosion was only part of it. What mattered more was what the British understood that the Germans refused to believe. To understand why 600 men sailed into a fortified harbor with almost no chance of getting out, you have to understand what was keeping the Admiralty awake in London. Her name was Tirpitz. Tirpitz was the largest battleship ever built by a European power. 42,000 tons of steel, armor, and killing power. 8 15-inch guns capable of hurling shells over 20 miles. Belt armor 13 inches thick. Deck armor so heavy that conventional bombs bounced off without penetrating. She was the sister ship of the Bismarck. The same Bismarck that had annihilated HMS Hood with a single salvo in May of 1941 and forced the Royal Navy into the most desperate chase in its history. The Bismarck was eventually cornered and sunk, but Tirpitz survived, and by early 1942, she had sailed north to the Norwegian fjords, where she waited like a coiled serpent at the edge of the Atlantic convoy routes. She did not need to fight. She only needed to exist. As long as Tirpitz floated, the Royal Navy could not release its capital ships for other duties. Every convoy to Murmansk had to be escorted by battleships, cruisers, and carriers, not because Tirpitz would definitely attack, but because she might. The mere threat of her breaking into the Atlantic forced Britain to lock down enormous resources in the north. Churchill called her the Beast. The strategic bind was maddening. Britain could not sink her. The fjords were too deep for submarines, too narrow for a fleet engagement, too heavily defended for bombers. RAF raids dropped hundreds of tons of ordnance on her anchorage and barely scratched the paint. And yet leaving her alone was not an option either. If Tirpitz ever reached the Atlantic convoy lanes, she could do what the Bismarck had done, only longer and worse. But the Beast had one vulnerability that nobody in Berlin seemed to have thought through. If Tirpitz ever suffered serious damage at sea, a torpedo hit, a bomb strike, even a collision, there was only one dry dock between Norway and Germany, large enough to repair her. It was at Saint-Nazaire, on the French Atlantic coast. The Normandie Dock had been built in the 1930s to service the great French ocean liners. The Normandie herself, the largest passenger ship in the world at the time. The dock was over 1,100 feet long, 164 feet wide, and 54 feet deep. It was the only facility in occupied Western Europe capable of handling a warship of Tirpitz's displacement. Without that dock, Tirpitz could never risk a long-range sortie. Any damage would force her to limp back to Germany through the narrow straits patrolled by British submarines and aircraft. The odds would no longer favor the Germans. A single dry dock. That was the choke point. And the British decided to destroy it. The problem was that Saint-Nazaire was not merely defended, it was a fortress. The port sat at the mouth of the Loire River, 5 miles inland from the open sea. The only approach was through a narrow estuary studded with sandbars and shoals. Large ships could navigate the channel only at high tide, and only if they knew the exact route. On both banks, German coastal batteries commanded every angle. The harbor itself was ringed with anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, machine gun nests, and a garrison of over 5,000 troops. The Kriegsmarine had classified Saint-Nazaire as impregnable to surface attack. Their analysis was not unreasonable. Any conventional naval assault would require capital ships to engage the coastal batteries, ships that Britain could not afford to lose. An airborne assault would be slaughtered before it reached the dock. A commando raid from submarines would never deliver enough men or enough explosives to destroy the caisson. Every approach had been studied. Every approach had been rejected. But the British planners looked at the same intelligence and asked a different question. What if they did not try to survive the approach? What if they sent a ship that was already meant to die? The man who proposed the core idea was Captain John Hughes Hallett of Combined Operations. The concept was savage in its simplicity. Take an old destroyer, fill her bow with time-delayed explosives, and ram her into the dock gate at full speed. The collision itself would not destroy the gate. The caisson was reinforced steel, but it would jam the ship into position. Then, hours later, long after the crew had abandoned her and the Germans had swarmed aboard to inspect the wreck, the hidden charges would detonate. At the same moment, a force of commandos would land from small boats, storm the dock infrastructure, and destroy every piece of machinery that could be rebuilt. The pumping equipment, the winding gear, the secondary gates, the power stations. By the time the Germans realized what had happened, the Normandie Dock would be rubble. The entire assault phase would last 90 minutes. Any longer, and reinforcements would overwhelm the small landing force. There would be no relief. There would be no second wave. The men who went in would have to get themselves out, or die trying. Combined Operations called it Operation Chariot. And they chose the most expendable ship in the Royal Navy. HMS Campbeltown had been built in 1919 as USS Buchanan, a flush-deck destroyer designed for convoy escort in the last year of the First World War. By 1940, she was obsolete, one of 50 aging American destroyers transferred to Britain under the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. The Royal Navy accepted them because they had no choice. Churchill privately called them rust buckets. Campbeltown was perfect. Her four-stacker silhouette could be modified to resemble a German Mu-class torpedo boat. Her shallow draft meant she could navigate the Loire estuary, even at moderate tide. Her age meant the Navy would not weep if she never came back. And her bow could be packed with death. The conversion began at Devonport in absolute secrecy. Workers cut down 2 of her 4 funnels and raked the remaining 2 at an angle to match the German profile. They removed the aft gun mounts to reduce weight and installed extra armor plating around the bridge. They stripped out every fitting that was not essential to one final voyage. Below the forward deck, they built a steel compartment and lined it with concrete. Inside that concrete, they placed 24 Mark 7 depth charges, 4.5 tons of Amatol explosive, enough to vaporize a city block. The charges were wired to delayed action pencil fuses set to detonate approximately 8 hours after arming. When the work was done, she looked from a distance, like a German warship returning from patrol. Up close, she was a floating bomb with a crew of 75. The volunteers were told almost nothing. They knew only that the mission was exceptionally dangerous, that many of them would not return, and that success would strike a serious blow against the German war machine. 611 men signed on. The commandos came from No. 2 Commando and supporting units, young, aggressive, trained in demolitions, close combat, and silent killing. They had rehearsed assaults on dock facilities in England, learning to place charges by touch in total darkness. Most of them had never seen real combat. The sailors were hand-picked from the destroyer and motor launch flotillas. They understood that their job was to get the soldiers ashore and hold the boats under fire until extraction, if extraction was even possible. The commander of the naval force was Commander Robert Ryder. He was 40 years old, experienced, calm under pressure, and had already survived a harrowing small boat voyage across the Atlantic. His role was to oversee the approach, coordinate the flotilla, and make sure Campbeltown reached the dock gate. The commander of the military force was Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Charles Newman. known universally as Colonel Charles Newman. He was 37, physically tough, direct in manner, and utterly committed to his men. He would lead the commandos ashore and take personal command of the fight for the dock. And the man responsible for driving the bomb into the target was Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty. Beatty was 33 years old, a career naval officer who had spent most of his service in destroyers. He was not flamboyant. He did not seek attention. He was quiet, professional, and absolutely certain that his duty was to put the bow of his ship through that dock gate, regardless of what the Germans threw at him. He had made peace with the arithmetic. The mission might cost his life. It would certainly cost his ship. But if he succeeded, the Tirpitz would never threaten the Atlantic again. On March 26, 1942, the flotilla departed Falmouth under cover of darkness. The force consisted of the Campbeltown, 16 Fairmile B motor launches, a motor gunboat, and a motor torpedo boat. 2 Hunt-class destroyers, HMS Atherstone and HMS Tyndale, escorted them across the Bay of Biscay and then turned back before the final approach. For 2 days, the small convoy sailed south under clear skies. The weather held. No German aircraft spotted them. An RAF bombing raid on Saint-Nazaire that night was intended to distract the defenders and mask the sound of approaching engines. But the bombers found heavy cloud cover over the target and dropped only a handful of bombs. The diversion failed. The Germans were awake and alert when the flotilla entered the estuary just after midnight on March 28th. The tension aboard every vessel was almost unbearable. The motor launches were made of plywood and mahogany. They had no armor. Their fuel tanks were fully exposed. A single hit from a 20mm shell could ignite them. They carried extra petrol drums on deck for the return voyage, drums that would become incendiary bombs at the first German tracer. The Campbeltown ran with German signal lamps rigged and a Kriegsmarine ensign flying from her mast. The ruse might work for a few minutes. It could not survive close inspection. The commandos crouched below decks, their faces blackened, their weapons ready, their demolition charges wrapped in canvas. Some prayed, some joked, most said nothing at all. At 0:45, 5 miles from the harbor, a German signal station on the southern shore challenged the approaching column by lamp. On the bridge of the lead motor gunboat, a signalman named Leading Seaman Pike answered in German. He flashed a captured call sign, the identification of a German torpedo boat known to be operating in the area, and transmitted a prearranged message. The formation had been damaged by enemy action and was requesting permission to proceed to harbor. The bluff worked, barely. For several excruciating minutes, the signal station went silent. German shore batteries tracked the column, but did not fire. Searchlights swept across the water without locking on. Then, at 01:20, the lights found them. Every gun in the estuary opened fire simultaneously. The water around the flotilla turned white with shell splashes. Tracers crisscrossed the darkness in overlapping streams. The first motor launch took a direct hit to the engine compartment and exploded, killing everyone aboard. The second was holed below the waterline and began to sink. The third caught fire amidships, her fuel drums igniting in a column of orange flame that rose 50 feet into the air. The commandos aboard the burning launches had two options: burn to death or jump into the freezing water and drown. Many chose the water. Few survived. But the Campbeltown did not stop. Beatty ordered full speed. The old destroyer surged forward through the barrage, her engines screaming, her hull ringing with impacts. German 20mm and 40mm shells punched through her thin plating like paper. Men fell on the deck. The forward gun crew was wiped out. A fire broke out near the bridge and had to be smothered with blankets. Beatty held the wheel and did not flinch. Beside him, his navigation officer fed him course corrections by instinct. The channel was narrow, the tide was falling, and a single miscalculation would run them aground short of the target. At 01:33, the dock gate came into view through the smoke and searchlight glare. The outer caisson of the Normandie Dock was a massive steel structure designed to hold back the tidal surge of the Loire. It was the only thing standing between the dry dock and the open estuary. Beatty aimed directly at its center. The helmsman beside him had already been wounded. The navigator was reading corrections from a blood-spattered chart. Half the bridge windows were blown out. The noise was so loud that orders had to be shouted directly into ears. None of it mattered now. What mattered was speed and angle. At 01:34, 4 minutes behind schedule, HMS Campbeltown struck the caisson at approximately 19 knots. The impact was catastrophic. The bow crumpled 36 feet into the gate. Steel screamed against steel. The entire forward section of the ship accordioned inward. Men were thrown from their feet. Rivets popped along the hull, but the ship held together, barely, and wedged herself into the gate like a knife jammed into a door. The engines were still running. The deck was covered with dead and wounded. German fire continued to rake the superstructure. Beatty gave the order to abandon ship. The commandos poured over the sides and onto the dock. They were under fire before their boots touched concrete. German machine gun nests had clear sight lines across the entire facility. Soldiers fell within seconds of landing. But the survivors kept moving. Their targets were specific: the pumping station that emptied the dry dock, the winding house that controlled the inner caisson, the fuel tanks, the power stations, the backup gates, and the submarine pens nearby. Each demolition team carried pre-measured charges and had memorized their objectives in the dark. Colonel Newman landed with the first wave and immediately took command. He had no radio contact with most of his teams. He had no accurate picture of the German response. He only knew that his men were dying and that the mission had to be completed before the dock could be reinforced. For the next hour, the commandos fought a running battle through the dock complex. Sergeant Thomas Durant, aboard one of the surviving motor launches, manned a twin Lewis gun and engaged a German patrol boat at point-blank range until he was hit multiple times and could no longer stand. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, the only one in the war to be recommended by a German officer. Sergeant Thomas Frank Durant died of his wounds, but his covering fire allowed other boats to land their men. The pumping house demolition team, led by Lieutenant Stuart Chant, reached their objective under heavy fire. Chant had been wounded in the leg during the approach. He limped into the pumping station, set the charges on the machinery, and gave the order to withdraw. The pumps that drained the Normandie Dock were blown apart in a single detonation. The Winding House team destroyed the gears that operated the inner caisson. Another team demolished the fuel storage tanks. A third attacked the electrical station. But the extraction plan had already collapsed. Most of the motor launches were burning in the estuary. The few that had landed their commandos were either sunk or too damaged to make the return voyage. German reinforcements were flooding into the dock area from every direction: infantry, naval personnel, armed dock workers. By 0200, the demolitions were complete. The commandos had done what they came to do. But they could not get out. Newman gathered the survivors, barely 100 men, many of them wounded, and ordered them to fight their way into the town. His plan was to escape overland, cross into unoccupied France, and reach Spain. It was not a plan with high odds, but staying in the dock meant certain death or capture. The breakout failed within hours. The Germans cordoned off the area and hunted the commandos street by street. A few small groups made it out of the town. 5 men eventually reached Spain. Everyone else was killed or captured. Newman was taken prisoner at dawn. So was Beatty. They were marched past the wreck of the Campbeltown, still jammed in the dock gate, still smoldering, and still surrounded by German officers and technicians examining the damage. The Germans believed the raid had failed. The Campbeltown was clearly finished, a burned-out hulk wedged into the structure. Senior German officers came to inspect her. Engineers began assessing repairs. Soldiers climbed aboard and posed for photographs. A crowd of French dock workers gathered nearby under guard. Nobody searched below the forward deck. At 10:35 in the morning, 9 hours and 1 minute after the collision, the delayed action fuses reached 0. 4.5 tons of amytal detonated inside the hull of HMS Campbeltown. The explosion was heard miles away. The entire bow of the ship vaporized. The dock caisson, the gate that held back the Loire, was torn apart like wet cardboard. Steel fragments weighing hundreds of pounds were hurled across the dock complex, smashing through buildings, shredding vehicles, killing men who had been standing 100 yards from the blast. A column of smoke and debris rose 300 feet into the morning sky. The dry dock flooded instantly as the river poured through the shattered gate. And the Germans had packed the ship with their own men. The French. In the immediate aftermath, panic swept through the German garrison. Nobody knew if there were more bombs. Nobody knew which structures were safe. That afternoon, a second explosion, possibly a delayed charge, possibly an accident in the fuel stores, ripped through another part of the dock area. When order was finally restored, the damage assessment began. German. In fact, 611 men had sailed from Falmouth. 169 of them were dead. Over 200 were prisoners of war. Only 228 returned to England. Most of them sailors from the escorting destroyers who had never entered the estuary at all. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded, an extraordinary number for a single operation. Beatty received one. Newman received one. Durant received one posthumously. 2 more went to men who died in the dock. 89 other decorations followed. Distinguished service orders, military crosses, conspicuous gallantry medals. But no amount of ribbon could account for what those hours had cost. The cost was also strategic, and it extended far beyond one dry dock. The Germans, shaken by the success of the raid, reinforced every Atlantic port with massive concrete fortifications. They diverted thousands of workers and millions of tons of material to coastal defenses, labor and resources that might have gone to the Eastern Front, to the U-boat pens, or to the Atlantic Wall. They became convinced that the British were capable of almost anything, a belief that would shape their response to every deception operation for the rest of the war, including the phantom invasions that covered D-Day 2 years later. Saint-Nazaire taught Hitler's high command a lesson they never forgot. The British would accept almost any cost for the right target. That fear haunted German planning until the end of the war. And Tirpitz? She stayed in Norway. She never sailed into the Atlantic. She was attacked repeatedly by RAF bombers, by carrier aircraft, by midget submarines. She was damaged, repaired in place, and damaged again. In November 1944, Lancaster bombers carrying 12,000-pound tallboy earthquake bombs finally capsized her at her moorings. She never fired her main guns at an enemy ship. She never sank a convoy. She never fulfilled the purpose for which 42,000 tons of German steel had been built. Because by the time the RAF finished her, the only dry dock in Western Europe that could have saved her was still lying underwater in Saint-Nazaire. The mathematics of the raid were brutal, but they were also elegant. One old destroyer, a ship already destined for scrap, traded for the permanent neutralization of the most powerful surface raider in the German fleet. A few hundred commandos traded for the strategic paralysis of an entire battleship for the rest of the war. The British had not needed to sink Tirpitz. They had only needed to destroy the one place where she could ever be fixed. And they had done it with a weapon the Germans did not even recognize until it was too late. The strangest irony came later. For months after the raid, German naval intelligence refused to believe that the British had deliberately sacrificed a destroyer as a floating time bomb. The idea was too cold, too calculating, too ruthless. They concluded that the explosion must have been an accident. Perhaps the ship's depth charges had cooked off. Perhaps a fuel leak had ignited. The possibility that the British had planned it from the beginning, had built the bomb into the concrete, had timed the fuses to detonate while German officers stood aboard, had accepted from the start that most of the crew would not come home, was beyond what the German command structure could accept. But it was the truth. The men who sailed into Saint-Nazaire knew the odds. They did not go because they expected to survive. They went because the calculation made sense. One dry dock was worth more than one ship. One battleship neutralized was worth more than 200 lives. That is not a comfortable truth, but it is the truth that won the war. Today, a memorial stands at Saint-Nazaire. Every year, on the anniversary of the raid, survivors and their descendants travel to the port to lay wreaths and remember. The town has never forgotten the men who came ashore that night. British soldiers who fought and died to destroy a German dock on French soil, for a reason most of the townspeople did not understand until years later. Somewhere beneath the rebuilt harbor, under layers of silt and reconstruction, there are still fragments of the Campbeltown. The ship that was built in 1919, mothballed, transferred, stripped, disguised, packed with explosives, and driven into a steel gate at 19 knots while her crew died around her. She was never meant to come back. She completed her mission. And the dock she destroyed never repaired another warship again. If this story found you, it is because history holds thousands of operations like this one. Missions planned in secret, executed by men who understood the cost, and then quietly erased from public memory, while the big campaigns took the headlines. This channel exists to find those stories, to bring them back, to make sure the men who volunteered for the mathematics of war are not forgotten by the generations who inherited the peace. Because some sacrifices are not about glory. They are about arithmetic, about understanding which targets matter more than ships, more than careers, more than survival itself. The crew of the Campbeltown understood that. So did the commandos who landed beside her. So did the planners in London who sent them. And when the fuses burned down and the bow of that old destroyer finally exploded, the equation balanced. One scrap metal ship, one impossible mission, one dry dock that never opened again, and a beast that never reached the Atlantic.